Hey, welcome back to our study this week. And we've been looking at Genesis here for a while. And today we're looking at 39, 1 through 6. And this study is called From Slave to Master. Because we're going to watch Joseph start off as a slave and then go to become a master in the house. So let's look at that. First, the Lord blesses Joseph here. As we learned from the end of chapter 37, Moses reminds us that Joseph was taken by the Ishmaelite traders down to Egypt and were sold to the captain of Pharaoh's guard, whose name is Potiphar. Moses writes that the Lord was with him, and the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. Moses uses the name of God here to really impress upon us that, it's the God of covenants. It's the covenant God that is behind all of this. As we read through this story, we're continually confronted with the idea that God's promises that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have to come true. As we read through Joseph, we see this. This started with Abraham, actually started back with Adam and Eve, but specifically with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, all these things that God has promised has to come true. None of the events, the successes, and the trials are brought about solely here by Joseph's actions. A lot of stuff's happening out of his control. And what he's doing doesn't really impact his life around him. We'll see a lot of stuff happens to him, not because of him. But because the Lord was with Joseph, he became a successful man. God's blessing was on Joseph, and so Joseph was placed in Potiphar's house to work not out in the field, but in the house itself. So Joseph was a good servant. And after some time, Potiphar took notice of the fact that he was a really good man. He was a good servant. And this reminds me of what Paul says in Colossians 3:22 through 24. He tells the bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service, as people pleasers, but with a sincere heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord, not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. And I think this would be a fair description of Joseph here, right? He's serving the Lord, serving God, not just Potiphar, but he's ultimately serving his God. Well, due to his faithful service and the blessing of God, Joseph was promoted. Instead of being a common house slave, Potiphar made him in charge of all that he had. He became the overseer or steward of the house. In ancient Egypt, if you look at the monuments there, the overseers were depicted recording the expenditures and labor of the house. So you see that in hieroglyphics and the paintings and stuff like that. They're the ones with the record keepers. They were taking oversight of all the daily activities, the expenditures, the coming in and going out kind of stuff. So that's what Joseph had. Joseph went from favorite of his father to some chattel to the overseer of one of the most important households of Egypt. And so you see this roller coaster he's on. And a lot of it didn't have anything to do with him. He was faithful to his God, and that's, bad things happened when he was faithful to God, and good things happened when he was faithful to God. And so we see this happening in his story here. Well, the interesting thing here, too, is that not only is Joseph blessed, but the Lord blessed Potiphar as well. We again return to a common theme as God blesses the unbeliever because of the believers. We saw it with Lot and with Jacob, and now we have it in Joseph. Verse 5 says that the Lord blessed the Egyptian house for Joseph's sake. God will cause the wicked to gain status, to gain prosperity, to gain wealth for the good of his children. The wealth was not an end in itself, but only a means to a greater purpose. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all received wealth as a blessing from God. But the blessing of wealth was to be used for God's purposes, not for themselves. So, when Potiphar elevates Joseph, he finds that he is blessed, and his house and his fields are all blessed. His household is growing, his fields are doing well, he's prospering financially. And so wisely, Potiphar puts Joseph in charge of everything except for the food that he ate, which is probably due to the Egyptians' belief that eating with the Hebrew people was an abomination to them, which makes sense. So we find that in Genesis 43:32, where it's described that they couldn't eat together. They weren't allowed to eat in each other's presence. So Potiphar gave Joseph everything except for his, which we'll find out in a minute, his wife and the food that he ate. Someone else was in charge of that. But God is blessing him. We should also remember that God told Abraham that he and his offspring would be a blessing to the nations. Now we know ultimately what that means. It would be Jesus Christ, right? But as they're going throughout their lives, living their lives, even in their own time, a lot of times they were a blessing. Sometimes we saw that they brought curse, they brought problems if they were disobeying God, but they were obeying God, following him, then they would bless the nations. God would bless the nation that these believers lived in. So if the believers were being faithful, God would bless the nation. If they were not being faithful, then God would not bless the nation. Sometimes, because of the believers, problems would come upon the nation. Now, that's interesting because, what's going on in our own nation? We could put it off, well, look at all these unbelievers doing blah, blah, blah. But really, it could be possible, not saying 100%, but it could possibly be the result of believers not obeying God, not following him and what he's told them to do. Could God have brought trouble to America because the Christians in the country aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing? They're being disobedient, or they're sinning against God. This story here opens the possibility, right? That is a possibility. That's something that God has done in the past. Could he do it now? Sure. Could he bless a nation? Could he protect a nation? Could he cause a nation to grow because believers are being obedient to him and, giving their lives for him? He can do that too. So there's nothing in the New Testament, I don't think, that would say that this couldn't happen. And so we can, we should think about that. And we should always obey God. But that's just another kind of layer on top of that, right? There are consequences for when we, even as individuals, don't obey God. So think about that today. Mull that over, and then come back next time, and we'll take a look at how Joseph overcomes temptation. And we'll look at verses 6 through 12, the last half of 6 through verses 12.